so that way I can reference it, and the area that I'd be talking about is no more than 10 to 30 acres. The first zone is what I like to call the useless turd. It's a small 7-acre parcel that is right up against the road on the corner of the property, and is separated from the rest of the property by the front swamp, which I'll describe in a second. So it's not really usable. Theoretically, I could build something there, but it will be so far removed from everything else that it just doesn't make any sense. That being said, there's a lot of loose rock there that I'll probably harvest for building, and there's quite a few trees that are probably useful for both firewood and for building, so I will get resources from there at some point. So next is the front swamp. It's 15.5 acres, and on one end it's fairly shallow where it butts up against the road, and on the other end it's actually fairly deep. And then there's a narrow that happens just off my property where there's a beaver dam that holds it all back. That water ultimately flows back down around the Highlands, which I'll get to in a second, and flows down the creek through the middle. In some ways, it's a relatively pretty water feature, but otherwise useless land. Next is where we are right now, the core. I call it the core for obvious reasons. It's the center of everything. It's where I'm going to put the house, where the driveway is, where the gardens are going to be, and almost all the structures. It's 24.5 acres, and generally speaking, the most usable part of the land. The lower core is the section of the creek lowland that is next to the core down the hill. It's about 30 feet down the hill and relatively flat, fully treed. And I'm guessing at some point the creek had a lot more flow because there's all sorts of big rocks that are scattered through all of that. And they're all arranged in ankle breaker style. That means it's difficult to walk through at best because you have to be really careful where you step because the moss might cover a hole. And if you step in one of those things, break your ankle. That section of the property is about 21 acres, but it's got a lot of fairly large pine, and I'm guessing that's where I'm going to get some of my ridge beams from and some of the roof timbers for the house. Next up is the Razorback. The Razorback is about 5 acres, and it is a sheer cliff edge that runs along the creek. The Razorback is by far my favorite part of the property, at least visually speaking. It is a very, very narrow slice of rock, water off one side and then the lower core on the other. And it goes up almost vertically 30 feet. Sitting on top, it feels like you're on the razor's edge of a mountain. Obviously nowhere near as high as most mountains are, but for this area, it's a relatively dramatic feature that I can't say I've ever seen in Northern Ontario. The Highlands, which are next to the core, basically I cut it in half just so that way it's relatively easy to describe the two, goes up to another 30 feet above the relative level of the core. So it's about 60 feet above the creek level. It's about 21.75 acres, and by far the rockiest part of the property. On top, it's relatively flat, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to build the house up there. And there's a few relatively large pines scattered around, and the fault goes through there as well, which creates a bit of a low spot, but for the most part, it's high and exposed. Next up is the interior. It's about 33.5 acres. The first part of it is a slope, steep slope, that faces the creek. It's about 50 feet high and pretty dramatic when you're standing on it. It doesn't look crazy from the drone footage, but it's pretty steep. Then it gets maybe about 5 feet lower than the Highlands at its highest point, and then it slopes away for the rest of the balance and goes into the neighboring property. And it's relatively flat. I've walked through there a few times, and generally speaking, it's just open boreal canopy. Next is canyon country. It's another interesting feature on the property where it's basically a crack in the rock, and it's a very sharp crack. At the bottom, there's a beaver pond that is filled it with water. The cliffs go 40 feet straight up. And it's a really dangerous part of the property because the cliffs are more than 90 degrees. So if you were to walk up to it, you could easily fall over the edge and not really realize where you were until it was too late. And so I don't see myself spending a lot of time over there just because it is dangerous, especially if I'm walking the dog. I don't want to risk him getting somewhere where it's irrecoverable. That being said, to access the lakefront, I have to find a way across there. And there's a little narrow section between the lowlands and canyon country that is probably where I would be able to afford to cross there. But having gotten myself through there a couple of times, like it's almost certainly going to require a set of stairs because it's really steep. And there might be some better paths, but I haven't spent enough time sort of going through figuring out what the options are. And then there is the lowlands, which I just mentioned, and that's another swamp that goes between canyon country and the top end of the creek, at least relative to my property. And there's not a lot of standing water there, and there's a lot of tufts of grass and other vegetation that you can, technically speaking, walk across it, but there's a good chance you're going to get wet. That area is a nesting area for some sandhill cranes, which are some pretty big birds, pretty distinctive sound as well. And they've been nesting there for almost the entire time that I've been coming here. Now, between the lowlands and the creek, well, of course, I should mention the creek. The creek goes through the bottom of the L, basically cuts off the two sides of the L, and it ranges between 70 and 150 feet wide. It's relatively deep in some locations. I'm guessing at least 30 feet. But that's as a result of a bunch of beaver dams. So while it's a creek, the water doesn't really flow very much. There's several dams upstream and there's several dams downstream, none of which are on my property. So it's relatively stagnant, but the water level does go up 1 or 2 feet every year. Is the barrier for me to get across to the rest of the land. And so relatively soon, I think I'm going to be building at least a raft, if not a full bridge to get myself across there. The creek represents about 15 acres of my total land. Then we have the ridge, which is an extension of the cliffs that run along the interior between the creek and the lowlands. It's visually interesting, but you really can't do anything with it, and it's about 17 and a half acres. The Backstrap is about 27 and a half acres. It's a strip of land between canyon country and the lowlands and the lakefront. It's more or less lumpy rock, has a few really, really big pines on it, but is not really that dramatic. It's relatively flat, and on either end there's a small cliff. The lakefront itself is about 1,900 feet of shoreline, and that area that I'm calling the lakefront is about 20 acres. It is sloped fairly dramatically down from the backstrap and is full of very small, scrubby spruce. It's really hard to walk through there. I've only been to that section of the lake once, and it was really hard going. At one end where the lake opens up a little bit, it's a little bit better, but for the most part, it's not pleasurable walking. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next week when I'm hoping to get the mosquito traps installed and do a few more things around the property that's going to make it even more usable for me as time goes on, so I can start spending more time focusing on the doing versus the talking. See you next time. While I was recording this, I got a notification. As I mentioned, I want to turn the meadow. My buddy the bear was coming for a visit. I never actually saw him. I think he might be camera shy, but fork. Why in the hell? For the most bloody hell. Booga booga booga. Seriously, bugs are annoying. It's not nearly as quiet here as you would think it would be. Civilization encroaches on everything. Part 2, just in cases. It's hot. And so here we are. plane, the plane.